Welcome back to the Carbon Farm Planning COMET-Farm tutorial using the Allee demonstration farm. My name is Haley Nagel, the Outreach and Education Specialist for the COMET-Farm team at Colorado State University. In the previous video, we defined our baseline management practices and demonstrated the drag and drop crop rotation and copy feature. In this video, we will be defining our future scenarios for our parcels. While our baseline management was the same for each parcel, we will implement our modifications to management practices that we determined in our initial planning phase. This video will include the future scenario for the crop parcel and the windbreaks and hedgerows. A detailed description of the remaining parcels will be included in the video's description as well as the Carbon Farm Planning curriculum. Let's start adding our future management scenarios. Once you have entered your baseline management here, you can select the Skip Ahead button at the bottom. Select No Thanks because we are done adding our cover crops. And we will have the option to copy more of our data over to different parcels in different years, but remember anything that is highlighted in red indicates that this crop year has data already. So we will select No Thanks. At this point, you will be prompted to keep editing or you can continue to future management, which is what we will select now. This future management scenario models your new practices superimposed on the baseline to compare the differences in emissions. You may have up to 10 different future management scenarios to compare to the baseline. Here you will name your first scenario. So we will just name this Carbon Farm Plan Scenario 1. You have the option of copying over baseline management to the future. This can help to minimize your data entry load. Because our future management differs greatly from our baseline, we will just name our scenario and select Start. We will begin with the cropland parcel. So to find our parcel, we are looking at the drop-down menu above the map. We will go to Crops. Major changes in the management for this parcel include a more diverse crop rotation, addition of cover crops, reduction in tillage intensity, adding grazing events, and replacing nitrogen fertilizer with compost applications before the corn and soybean planting. We will begin by using the drag and drop crop rotation feature that will set our initial rotation. We can add in our cover crops later. So we are modifying our rotation we'll start with soybeans, corn, and we will also have a grass legume mix. These will all be no irrigation and no tillage. Remember, you can modify this tillage and irrigation later on those panels in the future management scenario, similar to the baseline management. So we will select Create our rotation. So I will go in and add in our management practices from this top navigation pane for our soybeans. We will modify the planting date for what is in our plan while leaving the remaining information with the default values from COMET-Farm. If you do wish to modify these, again, you can select each of these boxes to input your own numbers. We will then move on to our tillage implements and planting. We have no grazing events for the soybeans here, so we can move on by either selecting tillage at the top here, or we can scroll down to select next. We will have a no tillage event occur, but this will be changed to the date of planting. We will then select next, or we can go up to fertilizer application. For this future management scenario, we will no longer be using nitrogen-based fertilizers, so we will get rid of this by selecting the X button, and we will move on to manure and compost application. Here we will select Add New Manure Compost Application. The specifics on the amount applied, which we will change to 9 tons per acre at a 50% moisture level, and this will be changed to compost, and we will change our date applied to also on 5/16. This information on the compost used was in a Iowa State University report for this Allee demonstration farm. Similar to the baseline management, we will not be including any irrigation, liming, or burning events. So at this point, we are done inputting information for soybeans, so we will select Next. Here we have the opportunity to add our cover crop. So we will select yes, we will add an additional crop. Currently it is left as undefined until we add our additional crop. We will be looking for a seasonal cover crop, and we will be using the annual rye legume radish. Our planting date, we need to ensure that does not overlap with our soybeans. So this will be planted the day after the soybean harvest, which will be 10/10. Planting date is 10/10. This will be harvest in the following year on May 5th. We will have 0% residue removal. We will be adding a grazing event in here. If you have not selected an animal ag activity on your original homepage for this project, a warning sign will appear when you select the new grazing event. But because we've already added the animal ag, it's not going to warning. So our grazing events for this annual rye legume mix, we will start grazing on April 15th, 2021. We will end this grazing event on May 5th, 2021. And our rest days, it automatically sets to 1, but we can go in and modify that to 0 rest days. And our percent daily utilization will be set to 5%. So we can now move on to the tillage implementations for this annual rye legume mix. Our first tillage event will be at the time of planting. So our planting date was on 10/10/2020. Unfortunately, you have to use the calendar widget to enter your date. This will be a no-till planting. At the time of harvest, we will also include another tillage event, but this will be considered a crimping event. This will be on 5/05. Modify our tillage to crimp. Okay, we can now move on to the fertilizer application, which there is none. There is also no manure compost application, irrigation, liming, or burning. So at this point, we can go ahead and move on to copy these over to our other years. So I will select next, no thanks, and I will add these for crops in the experimental plot and then every third year. And then I will select copy and continue. Once you have successfully copied over your 2020's crop rotation to every third year for the crop and experimental plots, we can go ahead and continue editing to add in information for the second year of this crop rotation. So we're going to move to corn, and we're going to make the necessary modifications here. The corn here was planted on the default value of 5/06/2021. And the harvest date was October 22nd, 2021, and we will leave the projected yield and residue removal the same here as well. We can leave the grazing table blank for the corn and move on to the tillage implements and planting. The tillage pass would be converted from an intensive till to a no-till, and this date would need to change to 5/06/2021. Then we can move on to the next panel with fertilizer application. We are switching from nitrogen fertilizer to a compost application, so we can delete this fertilizer application and move on to the manure and compost. Here we will add in a new manure application. This date applied will be on our planting date, which is May 5th. We will need to modify the manure type to compost. And information taken from Iowa State University's report for the Allee demonstration farm noted 9 tons of compost per acre at 50% moisture. There were no irrigation events, no liming events, and no burning events. So at this point, we can move on to the second crop in this rotation, which is the grass legume mix. For the grass legume mix, we'll first need to ensure that the planting date is correct, which we do need to make a modification here. This would be planted on 10/23. For the purposes of our plan, we are not going to include a harvest date for this year, but if you did decide to do that, you could click Add New Harvest and determine the yield and the residue removal. We will also not include a grazing event on this table, but we'll include it on the following year. So we will move on to tillage implements and planting. The tillage implementation needs to be modified to the planting date, which was 10/23, and the no-till came from our original drag and drop crop rotation. Fertilizer application, there is none. There is also no manure or compost application, no irrigation events, liming, or no burning events. So at this point, we can scroll down to the bottom and we can select Next. We are done adding crops, so we will say no thanks, continue. And we will copy our data over to every third year for this crop rotation for both the crops parcel and the experimental parcel. We will then select copy and continue. We will select OK, and we will fix the perennial crop later. So at this point, we do need to keep editing because we still need to make modifications to the final year of our crop rotation. So we are going to 2022. For our grass legume mix, we need to ensure that this is a continued perennial crop from the previous year. If you do not select that, this will ask you to select a planting date, but we are going to continue the perennial crop. We're also not going to include all of these harvest dates. We're going to get rid of a few of those, and we're going to have a harvest date of October 15th, 2022. So we will need to modify this here. We will leave the other values of projected yield and the residue removal as the default values. And we will go ahead and add in a new grazing period. This grazing period will begin May 1st, 2022. And end October 15th, 2022. Our S days here will be 21, and our percent daily utilization will be 40%. This will represent a rotational grazing. So now we'll move on to our next pane, which is tillage implementation. For this, there will only be a crimping event at the harvest date. So this will be 10/15. And this will be a crimp event. Now we can move on to fertilizer application to ensure that there is none here. There is also not going to be a manure compost application, irrigation event, liming event, or a burning event. So we will select next. At this point, we would like to add a cover crop of another annual rye legume radish mix. So we will select yes, add an additional crop. Here we will select our crop from our seasonal cover crop list. And we will select our planting date. Remember, your planting dates must not overlap. So this will be October 16th, 2022. We will not be including a harvest event for this cover crop, as this cover crop primarily serves as forage for our grazing event here. So we will go ahead and add a new grazing event. This grazing event will go from April 2023 April 15th, 2023 to May 5th, 2023. We'll have to modify our rest period to 0 days and 5% utilization. Once we have inputted the grazing information, we can go ahead and move on to our tillage events. There will be 2 tillage events, one at the time of planting, so 10/16/2022. We will also need to modify our implementation pass. 10/16, we're going to change this to no-till. We'll also add another tillage implementation. This one will be a crimp event at the end of the grazing period. So this will be 5:05. Once you've added your tillage events, you can go on to the fertilizer application to make sure that there is none applied. There's also no manure application, no irrigation events, no liming events, or no burning events. So this time we can go ahead to the bottom and select next. Again, we have added all of the crops we are going to add. If you wanted to add an additional crop, you could select yes here, but we are going to select no thanks and continue. We're going to copy this over to 2022 for the experimental plot, and then every third year after that for the crop and experimental. Copy and continue. So we will continue. You can either continue to the next parcel here, or you can select keep editing to check back on your plots here, and you can select your next parcel that you're going to go to up at the top above the map. So we'll also demonstrate adding future management scenarios for windbreak, hedgerows, and shade tree parcels. We can do that all in the same one. So I'll begin with windbreak number 1 and 2. To model the difference in emissions for this one, originally this was involved in the annual crop rotation of corn soybean. To model the differences, we are going to add trees in the agroforestry component later and convert this area now to grass in the field management activity. So for this reason, we are going to make sure we're selected on the first year. We're going to select our crop type, which is going to be grass. We're not going to have any harvest dates, but we're going to modify our planting date to a little later in the season. April 15th works. We are also going to not add a harvest date, but we will continue on to the next page. We will include a no-till implementation on the date of planting. We'll go on to our fertilizer application to make sure that there is none. We will apply an application of compost at the initial date of planting. So this will also be on April 15th. We'll modify the manure type to compost. And again, from the Iowa State University's report, the amount applied is 9 tons per acre on average at 50% moisture. We will leave the other values as the default COMET values, but you can modify those if you have lab reports. We will go on to the irrigation page to make sure that there is none. There's no liming events and there were no burning events. We will copy this future management data to all windbreak, hedgerows, and shade parcels for the year 2020. We will not copy this to the 2021 to 2029 years yet because we will not be including planting, tillage, compost application data because it is a perennial crop. So I will click no thanks and continue. We're on windbreaks 1 and 2. This will be copied to all of the remaining windbreaks, to the shade trees, and to the hedgerows. We can go ahead and add in years 2021 and the remaining of the future management scenario. We're going to select our crop is still going to be grass, and we're going to continue this as a perennial crop from the previous year. We will not include any harvest or grazing tables because this land will be predominantly trees that we will include in the agroforestry management section of this. So we will ensure that there's no tillage event, fertilizers, manure application, irrigation, liming, or burning. So we'll select next. We will not add any additional crops for this year, and we will select no thanks, continue. We will add this to the remaining years for the windbreaks, hedgerows, and shade trees. So I will select all of these and then unselect this initial year. And on the last part, I realized I did not select shade tree 1. So I will go ahead and copy that over. We can go ahead and keep editing to check to make sure all of these are grass. They look to be good. For the remaining future management scenarios for the other parcels for the Allee demonstration carbon farm plan, please visit the document included in the description of this video. Stay tuned for the next video where we will define the animal agriculture, both baseline and future management scenario in our next section.